Welcome back to The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. We are here today with Christine Hayes, who is Sterling Professor Emeritus of Religious Studies at Yale University, and was actually the person who taught the Old Testament class that I took as an undergrad. So she introduced me to the Old Testament. We are so delighted to have you with us today, Professor Hayes. Thank you for being here.
Terrific. Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Right.
So we are talking about the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Ruth. And a little later in the conversation, I'll want to sort of ask about what it is to pair those books together. But let's start with Ezra and Nehemiah and just get some historical context. So we've gone through the Torah, Joshua, Judges, and into the prophets. We've had First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Ezekiel. We've seen the people go through exile, go into exile, and now with Ezra and Nehemiah, we're talking about the prospect here of return. Could you sort of set us up historically about what's happening in the land and in the empire surrounding it?
Sure. So these two books describe events that occur in the period that we refer to as the period of the Restoration, or sometimes it's called the Second Temple period, because the temple will be rebuilt by about the end of the 6th century. So it's describing this time of return or restoration, and it was not an easy time. If you've read the prophetic books, you know that the prophets not only talk about the punishment that will befall Israel for various sins or deviations from the covenant, but they promise this time of return or redemption. And so that was very much in the mind of those who did return. When Cyrus, who is the Persian emperor who conquered the Babylonians and established the Persian Empire, and he had a policy that sort of allowed indigenous peoples to return to their lands and build their temples and so on. And we have the historical decree. It's in the British Museum. You can go and see it, where he publishes this decree, and people are allowed to return. So this was a time of great excitement. People saw this as perhaps a fulfillment of some of the prophetic promises of return. The reality was a little bit different.
So what is that? What is the sort of set up that tension between sort of promise and reality? What are the expectations, and what are people actually encountering in this project?
Right. So the prophetic expectations vary. Some just see it as a time of return and political hegemony, a restoration of a Davidic king, and no more foreign rulers, no more Assyrians, no more Babylonians. People will finally recognize that Israel has its God, and they will leave Israel alone, right? That was sort of the prophetic promise, was that it would be a time of peace, nations wouldn't be at war anymore, and the Israelites would live in their own land and enjoy a certain kind of autonomy. Sometimes prophetic writings wax quite poetic about this and describe it almost as if there's a new birth of creation. The lion will lie down with the lamb and so on. We get in Isaiah. So sometimes the representations almost seem to be otherworldly, what we today think of messianic in the sense of messianic describing a different world. But at the time, messianic simply mean that a Messiah, a king appointed by God, would rule, a native Israelite king. So it would be the end of foreign dominion and so on. So first of all, the Persians are allowing Israelites to return, but not entirely as an independent people. They are now a province within the Persian Empire. And so their lives are still somewhat obviously regulated by imperial need. They're also returning to a situation of great hostility among many of the neighboring peoples. They first come, and when Nehemiah comes, he's going to come a little bit later in the 5th century, we believe. It's really hard to know exactly when some of these events occur, but when he comes in the 5th century, he has been a cupbearer to the Persian emperor, and he has heard about the plight of his people and how difficult things are and how they are set upon by surrounding peoples and so on. And so he wants to go and help, and he comes and he refortifies the city, rebuilding the city walls. The Samaritans nearby complain to the Persians and say, "Why are you letting this rebellious people rebuild the city walls? That's going to be trouble for you." The Persians order a halt. They have to make appeals. So there's just a lot of fighting with the community. There's a lot of suspicion that's raised by enemies among the Persians. And so things are start and stop. So it is a very difficult time. But more than that, Nehemiah and Ezra, who also is going to come from Babylon or the Persian Empire, back to what is now the province of Yehud, or Judea. He's going to come, and he is also going to lament what he sees as a decline in Israelite identity, a decline in Israelite worship of God, and so on. And he's going to have a diagnosis of the situation. In fact, both Ezra and Nehemiah are going to have a diagnosis of the situation, why things are not as good as they should be, and they're going to blame intermarriage for the decline of. Nehemiah sees that the people don't know Hebrew anymore. They're not speaking the Hebrew language. They're speaking the language of surrounding peoples. Language is fundamental to cultural identity. So he laments this. And Ezra and Nehemiah are going to innovate something that we have not seen in the biblical texts until now. And that is a universal ban on intermarriage and really assimilation of foreigners in any way.
Matt, you want to follow up on this one?
Well, just like how, and do we have a sense from these books of how easy an argument that is to make?
Right.
Right.
Yes, we do.
When households are established and people own land, I mean, all these things. So, I mean, it's not as simple as saying send everybody out, although that is decreed. I mean, do we have a sense of what the pushback looks like, or?
We do. This was extremely unpopular. So we have a long list. One of the things about the books of Ezra and Nehemiah is that it contains lots of lists, right? So it can be easy reading if you want to jump over those parts. You have lists of the people who return, but you also have a pretty detailed list of what happens when Ezra makes this decree. What's unusual about this is that we don't have in the biblical texts prior to this a universal ban on intermarriage. Certainly we have some specific peoples who are prohibited for marriage. So the Torah books prohibit intermarriage with the 7 Canaanite nations because the idea is that the Israelites are being given this land. And the rationale that's provided in those passages, they occur in Exodus primarily, but the rationale for not intermarrying with Canaanites is lest they turn you aside to the worship of foreign gods, right? That's the fear, is that they will corrupt your religious fidelity, your fidelity to the God of Israel, to Yahweh. So that's the rationale. The two other groups are prohibited in Deuteronomy 23. So the Moabites and the Ammonites are prohibited, and that's for historical reasons of historical enmity. The text says that they attacked the Israelites as they were making their way from Egypt through the desert and asked to be able to pass through those lands to enter into the land of Canaan, and they were refused. And not only were they refused, but they were attacked as they tried to pass. And so you shall not ever marry a Moabite and an Ammonite. There's this grudge. Egyptians are prohibited, but only for 3 generations, because there was a long period of time in which the Israelites lived well among the Egyptians and feel some kinship. There was a pharaoh who turned against them, but the sense of the biblical text in Deuteronomy 23 is that when things settle down in 3 generations, Egyptians can marry into the people. And so on. Plus, we just have many instances where other peoples, Phoenicians, others marry in. Moses, of course, married 2 foreign women, including one Cushite or Ethiopian. And Joseph, of course, marries an Egyptian and has children who are Israelites. And many Israelite kings had foreign wives, and their sons reign as Israelite kings. There's no question, because descent did pass through the patrilineal line. And so there are many intermarriages with foreign women. The matrilineal descent is only going to happen much later in Judaism, in the Roman period following Roman law. So it is not Pentateuchal or Torah law to have a universal ban on intermarriage, and we see plenty of intermarriage. And it's really a great innovation on Ezra's part. In fact, he has to come up with a new rationale for it in order to make it stick. And I think I should have the text somewhere here, but it's stated in chapter 9. I don't see it quickly. There it is. Where he... Sorry, wrong text. I will find it. Yeah, no. Ezra 9, there it is. Ezra 9, 1, 2. The officials approached Ezra and they said, "The people of Israel and the priests and the Levites have not separated themselves from the peoples of the lands with all their abominations, from the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, the Ammonites, the Moabites, the Egyptians, who actually are permitted, and the Amorites. For they have taken some of their daughters to be wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy seed has mixed itself with the peoples of the lands, and in this sacrilege, the hand of the officials and the chief men has been foremost. So Israel here is conceived really for the first time. We see this phrase also in the book of Malachi, which is roughly the same time period. Israel is conceived as a holy, meaning a separate seed. That's all the word holy means, separate or set apart. And you can't mix holy things with things that aren't holy. That will desacralize or desecrate them. And they say the people have desecrated the holy seed by mixing it with the seed of other peoples. And so Ezra says this is a desecration, and he orders a sacrifice to be brought, the sacrifice that you bring when you desecrate something holy. This is an entirely new rationale. Certainly, Israel has been exhorted to be holy, meaning be separate or different from other people by observing the covenant. But the idea that God has set Israel apart as a distinct and holy seed that can't be mixed with another is a new idea. And ultimately, it's one that failed. There was great resistance at the time. There's weeping and wailing. The list of people who have intermarried is long. It includes priests, it includes leaders, because it was innovative, right? It was not a sense that you could not take wives from other peoples. And that's why even priests and leaders engaged in this. And Ezra has to be pretty heavy-handed, and Nehemiah himself scurries about Jerusalem, trying to ensure that these rules are followed. And ultimately, it is going to be a failure as far as later Jewish tradition is concerned, because as you may or may not know, Jewish descent passes through the mother. You don't have to have two Jewish parents to be ethnically Jewish. One, the mother is enough, but also you can convert to Judaism, which is something that Ezra also, no assimilation was possible. And the only Israelite was an Israelite who had two Israelite parents. By the way, at roughly the same time in Athens, we have the same rule. The Athenians also passed the law that the only Athenian citizens were those who had two Athenian citizen parents, right? So there's something going on in the world at this time in terms of people defining their identities. And Ezra adopts this idea and enforces it. But as I say, it proves ultimately to be a failure. We have plenty of evidence that Jews at this time, other non-Jews, were assimilating into the Jewish community, and this will continue through subsequent Jewish history.
This, I think, might be the time to talk about Ruth, actually. I want to come back to Ezra and Nehemiah and talk about some of the other dynamics that we see in terms of establishing cultural identity there. But we're pairing this with the book of Ruth, which is not where it is in the Christian canon, although the Hebrew Bible does bring Ruth sort of more in this same, into the same area as Ezra and Nehemiah. What does it mean to read these texts together? What's happening in Ruth?
Right. It's very important to read them together. And this innovation of Ezra and Nehemiah, trying to sort of create and preserve what they saw as they saw the community being threatened, and they're trying to preserve a national and a religious identity for the Judean community at a time where its existence really was quite precarious. So I think, we have to sort of understand it from their perspective. But at the same time, there was tremendous pushback. And we see that pushback in a couple of places. I'll mention one other before I mention Ruth. You've read some of Isaiah. So if you read the third part of Isaiah, so chapter 56 in Isaiah, you will have read a text that we think dates to a later part of Isaiah, roughly to this time. Mm-hmm. And this is what it says in Isaiah 56. Let not the foreigner say, who has attached himself to Yahweh, Yahweh will keep me apart from his people. Let not the eunuch say, I am a withered tree. For thus said Yahweh, as for the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who have chosen what I desire and hold fast to my covenant, I will give them in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons or daughters. I will give them an everlasting name which shall not perish. As for the foreigners who attach themselves to Yahweh, to minister to him and to love the name of Yahweh, to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it, and who hold fast to my covenant, I will bring them to my sacred mount and let them rejoice in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and sacrifices shall be welcome on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples, right? So that's one text that we see is a very pointed pushing back on this idea of excluding foreigners, but also eunuchs, because in Deuteronomy 23, that same passage that says Moabites and Ammonites are prohibited also says that males who are castrated or eunuchs are also prohibited from entering the congregation. Nehemiah was probably a eunuch, we believe, and he himself did not enter the sanctuary. That's how he interpreted that phrase. Do not enter the congregation. He took that to mean the physical temple and sanctuary. He also threw an Ammonite out of the sanctuary of the temple, interpreting it that way. So we certainly see that sort of separatist element in books like Ezra and Nehemiah, but passages like Isaiah are clearly pushing back on that, which leads some of us to think that the book of Ruth, maybe less explicitly, is also pushing back on it, right? Isaiah 56 is quite explicit, but the book of Ruth in some ways can be read as pushing back on this. Now, that's a little hard to claim historically because we don't know when this book was written. Right? It may have been written before Ezra and Nehemiah's day, and we can talk about why that might have been. But it certainly became part of the canon in the post-exilic period, right? So to that extent, I think it's still legitimate to understand it as the community's response to something like Ezra and Nehemiah, right? The fact that they canonize alongside Ezra and Nehemiah, a book with a very different message, I think says something about the many voices that existed in the post-exilic community. So the book of Ruth is set in the period of the Judges, but there's a very good chance it was written later, maybe in the pre-exilic, maybe in the post-exilic period, but it certainly became canonical in the post-exilic period. And it's a story about a foreign woman, a Moabite no less, that's one of the groups that is explicitly listed in Deuteronomy 23 as being prohibited from entering the congregation, meaning through marriage or conversion or assimilation. And it's the story of this Moabite woman who, as you probably know, acts very nobly and enters the community of Israel by choice. And it really stands in pointed opposition to works that give a more negative view of foreigners, who see a ban on intermarriage or any kind of assimilation, or who give a purely genealogical definition of Israelite identity that was like the one promulgated by Ezra and Nehemiah, the one that ultimately would not entirely prevail. Genealogy is one way to be an Israelite and later a Jew, but it is not the only or exclusive way in subsequent Jewish history. So, I mean, there's more to say about Ruth because not only is it's not simply the story of a virtuous foreigner who, when really she had far better choices, right? When her Israelite husband dies, and her Israelite mother-in-law turns to her and says, I can't provide for you, says to her and her fellow sister-in-law, right? So Naomi has two sons who marry Moabite women. 10 years later, these men die. And so it's these three women unattached to males who can provide for them. Naomi turns to her daughters-in-law and says, go home. What can I do for you? Even if I were to bear sons today, are you going to wait until they grow up and to marry you? I can't provide for you. Go back to your father's homes. And Orpah, quite rationally and reasonably, says, oh, you're right. Yes, I should do that. I'm going home to my Moabite parents. And Naomi and Ruth says no, and gives what is, of course, one of the most famous speeches in the Bible, where you go, I will go. And she says, your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And I think it's fascinating that she puts the people first. It's not that she's had some vision of some divine being or has bought into certain sorts of religious. She loves Naomi. She loves the people. She loves the community. And she's willing to take this hard trek back to a land where she knows no one, and to work and to labor to secure some kind of way of life for this mother-in-law that she's come to love over the last 10 years. And it's that kind of commitment to the people, to the identity of the community, that shows her chesed, which is a word that's used repeatedly in the text to refer to her loving kindness that goes well above any kind of legal obligation, to just acts of goodness and kindness. But the real punchline in the story, of course, comes at the end, when she is assimilated into the community and she marries someone named Boaz, who is a sort of a distant relative. And she gives birth to a child who is in some ways really handed over or credited to Naomi. And then we're given the lineage of the child at the very, very end of the book. They named the child Oved. He was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David, King David, who is going to be the anointed king over Israel, the one with whom God will make a covenant that his house will reign forever. David, who's the one from whom the messianic king in the future and in the final age will, from him, it will descend. he is said to be the direct descendant, the great grandson of this foreign woman from the Moabites. And it's a really short and moving story that represents a strand of thought that stands in opposition to the line of thinking, or at least problematizes the line of thinking that we see in Ezra, with its call for a ban on intermarriage, for circling the wagons in times of crisis or calamity when community identity seems threatened. And this is saying not only can we assimilate a foreigner, but that foreigner could be the very vehicle for the future redemption and continuing of the community, right? She really is the one who's going to bring about the future redemption.
Yeah, no, that's incredible. And thank you for holding those two sort of side by side as, different voices, multiple voices that we're hearing from these texts. Can you talk about some of the other ways in this period, as we hear in Ezra and Nehemiah, that sort of communal identity is being established, right? We've got this sort of, we're building the wall with intermarriage, but talk about the sort of physical and also sort of the cultural or sort of legal sort of construction projects that are taking place. What is being built in this period and why? And I'd love to hear too about Hanan and Torah and what's new and different there too.
So when Ezra comes from Babylon, he brings with him, the text says, the Torah of Moses. And we don't really know what that means. Maybe something like the Pentateuch that we have today. Certainly he seems to have the priestly writings, and he certainly seems to have something like the book of Deuteronomy, because he refers to their teachings or their ideas. So he certainly seems to have that. But he brings the Torah of Moses, and he's charged with regulating the life in the province according to the teachings of Moses. So this is a huge part of his mission, is to reaffirm Israelite commitment to the covenant and its terms. So what we're seeing in this particular period is the coalescence of the previous traditions. Maybe they were gathered in the exile, but now they're being brought and being used in a regulative or a normative kind of way. These aren't just stories or traditions to think about, but one is supposed to conduct one's life in accordance with them, so that the Torah is really being seen as a book of instruction. I know it often gets translated as law. I'm always a little nervous about that in translation law. The word Torah literally comes from the word to mean to teach or to instruct. So they contain God's teachings or instructions. When we think of law, we tend to think of a written code, which you apply those words directly to a situation. Law in the ancient world wasn't quite like that. When you had to determine what people should do, you didn't look in a code book for black letter law and say, provision 1279 applies, so we have to do this here. The legal writings in antiquity were things that helped you think about and consider what justice looked like, so that you would be wise. And when you had to make a decision, you would draw upon the principles or the ethics contained in these writings. So the Torah was probably something like that. And it's going to be a few centuries before we see people treating it as more of a modern law code, writing down what the law is and should be applied. But Ezra certainly was bringing back a set of writings which start now to feel almost like he's almost represented as a second Moses. This is almost a second Sinai. It's a second giving of the teaching and the instructions. And he gathers the people together. The Torah is read out to the community, to the men and the women. So the entire community is mentioned. Men and women listen as the texts are read. Apparently, people no longer understand Hebrew. Nehemiah tells us that as well. So it's translated. There are people translating it into the Aramaic and also explaining and elaborating it on its meaning. So this is really one of the first times that we see this idea of people receiving these traditions and studying them and thinking about them and doing what your community is doing right now, right? Reading them and trying to elaborate their meanings and to see how it can influence the way they conduct their lives. So in many ways, we credit Ezra with establishing the Torah as the communal reference, if you will, right? The work that the texts that the community will use going forward to create its identity and to build community. So what's important to realize, however, is that even though Ezra may have unified the community around the Torah, whatever it consisted of at that time, he didn't necessarily unify them around a particular interpretation of the Torah. And in some ways, that's really then the beginning of later Judaism, which of course is a tradition of fulsome interpretation and often contradictory interpretations of the biblical text. But in some ways, it really began with Ezra.
In some ways, that makes the prohibition against intermarriage all the more, it's the right word, incomprehensible to, I mean, when you think about what binds this community together, when there's no temple and there's no book, or what it is small, the priesthood is, I assume, kind of in shambles or not well organized, at least. And is it just land then? Is there something about old promises that are still...
Right. So remember that the second temple, the temple does get rebuilt. Mm-hmm. So by about 516, the temple is rebuilt. And so we're going to have a good 580 years where you still are going to have a temple-centered Israelite identity. And priests are very much going to be operating, because we don't really have a king, right? The Persians are not going to allow that. It's going to take a Maccabean revolt to set up, a kingship. And even those kings acted almost more like priests, and the priests were kings. That's going to happen later for about 100 years. And then the Romans are going to put the kibosh on that. So it really is still, it's going to be a reconstructed, the reconstruction of Judaism, or of Israelite religion, that's going to happen now. And you can see me hedging and trying not to say Judaism just quite yet. But the reconstruction of Israelite religion that's going to happen now will be a temple-centered, but alongside it, we're seeing the establishment of Scripture and the reading of Scripture, the interpretation of Scripture growing, so that eventually, 500 years or so from now, when the temple is going to be destroyed, there is a communal identity built around the interpretation of Scripture. The foundation for that will have been laid, and that will emerge, but it's not quite yet, right? But that seed is being planted by Ezra.
Is there a national identity? Or is it just mostly about land? Or I know those are hard to separate.
Yeah, I think to a large extent, the identity that's going to bind so many Jews in this period really is around temple worship, temple practice, temple praise, sacrifices, which we have to remember, the sacrifices were about so much more than just atoning for sin. That's one type of sacrifice. The chatat sacrifice is the one that atones for sins. But there are tons of other sacrifices that sometimes scholars forget to talk about. They were offered in Thanksgiving. They were offered for various festivals and holidays. They were offered when one fulfilled a vow and felt particularly blessed. So sacrifice was a very meaningful form of worship in antiquity, not just for Israelites, but for really all pre-modern peoples. Sacrifice was an important center for religious worship and connection with God. So many of the disputes that erupted in Judaism in this period, in the periods of centuries before the Common Era, were disputes over proper ritual practice, whether the priests were doing the right things or whether the priests were corrupt. We have sectarian groups that go off into the desert because they don't like the way things are being done in the Jerusalem temple, or think that they're following the wrong calendar and celebrating festivals on the wrong days because they're not following a strictly solar calendar. So these are the kinds of things people argued about. They generally believed there was a God who had created the world, who had a covenant with the Israelites that could be fulfilled by living in the land and observing certain agricultural practices, ethical practices, cultic and temple practices, and so on. There's a pretty united identity around those sorts of things, right? But it had this element of citizenship and cultural identity that for many people it was believed would only be passed down by having a common language, a common set of texts, a common set of ritual practices. And those are disturbed, according to Ezra and Nehemiah, if foreigners dilute those things. This wasn't said at a time of strength. This was said at a time of incredible communal vulnerability, right? They returned to a devastated land where people are no longer even speaking Hebrew, have intermarried with other people and are worshiping other gods and doing other things. And so they say, no, we need to circle the wagons. Right or wrong, that's the historical context for what they did. But as I say, there was clear pushback, and ultimately it's not going to be the principle that's going to define membership within the Israelite and then later Jewish community. We know from historians like Josephus and from other ancient Jewish writers that people moved in and out of the Jewish community all the time. We know of people converting, not quite the right word, but assimilating into the community, becoming Jews quite frequently throughout this period.
You know, we've been encouraged throughout this to be thinking about these stories in the context of migration, and that reminder of this moment of vulnerability in the life of the community is a really, really important one. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
We have run the course of our time together. There's so much more that we could ask you about this, but Professor Hayes, we are delighted that you have been with us, and thank you. I know the congregation will really enjoy this conversation.
Thank you. Good luck wrestling with these really interesting texts.
Thank you.
Oh, we're gonna let Margaret do most of that work, I think.
I know, yeah, we've been splitting up who gets what passage, and Matt got 2 Samuel, and so now after that, it's my turn to take some hard texts, I think. Yeah. Well, thank you for being with us. Really appreciate it.
No, my pleasure.